Thank you for joining us on this look at the life of one of modern history's most enigmatic characters, Rasputin. Before we begin, please consider subscribing to our channel. Doing so helps more than you can imagine. Now dim the lights and get comfortable as we look at the life of Rasputin. Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin was born in January 1869 in the small Siberian village of Pokrovskoye. The village sat on the banks of the Tura River, far from the power and wealth of the cities. Winters were long and brutal. Summers were short and filled with hard work in the fields. Life was shaped by the land and by the church. Families lived close to the soil, surviving through farming, animals, and the rhythms of the seasons. Rasputin grew up in this harsh and simple world. His father Yefim was a farmer and a coachman. He carried goods for the community and often drank heavily. His mother Anna worked hard at home, raising the children and tending to daily chores. The family was not rich. They lived in a wooden hut like most peasants, with smoke from the fire filling the air in winter. Poverty was common and people depended on each other to endure the cold and the hunger that came with poor harvests. Disease often claimed lives early, and infant deaths were frequent. Rasputin's early years were shaped by this fragile existence. Not much is known of his childhood, but stories passed down paint him as restless and odd. He was tall, with piercing eyes that unsettled even in youth. He did not learn to read or write properly as a boy, for schools were rare in rural Siberia, and most peasants saw little need for letters. What mattered was strength, endurance, and faith. The village church stood at the center of daily life. Bells rang for services and feasts. Priests blessed crops and animals. Children grew up with prayers and icons as a constant presence. Rasputin absorbed this world of faith, though he was never pious in the way others expected. Villagers recalled that he was mischievous. He stole small things, picked fights, and wandered the fields when work needed doing. He developed a reputation for wild behavior and for staring at people in a way that made them uneasy. Some saw him as gifted with a strange energy, while others thought him troubled. The idea of holy men and visionaries was not unusual in Siberia, where the land was vast and lonely. Mystics roamed the countryside, preaching, blessing, or begging. People looked for signs of God in strange places, and a boy like Rasputin drew attention. His family suffered repeated tragedy. Several of his siblings died young, as was common. 2 brothers drowned in the river. A sister fell into a fire and later died. Such losses left deep scars on the household. Rasputin himself nearly died from illness, but survived. These brushes with death, combined with the grief of losing siblings, may have shaped his sense that his life carried a special meaning. In a world where survival seemed uncertain, those who lived through misfortune often felt touched by divine fate. Rasputin's teenage years were marked by more unrest. He became known for drinking and for stealing horses, a serious crime in rural Russia. Some stories claim he was caught and punished, though records are unclear. What seems certain is that his behavior set him apart. He did not follow the straight path expected of a peasant boy. Yet there was also a shift in him as he grew older. He began to turn toward religion in an unusual way, mixing his unruly nature with deep moments of prayer and reflection. He would vanish into the woods for days, returning with tales of visions. Some mocked him, others grew afraid, but many were curious. In a small community, such stories spread quickly. The Russia of Rasputin's youth was a land divided. Peasants made up the vast majority of the population. They worked on land owned by others and lived under harsh laws. Only a generation before, serfs had been freed, yet freedom did not bring equality. Most remained bound by poverty. They relied on tradition, faith, and community bonds to endure. Authority came from the Tsar in distant St. Petersburg. But in daily life, it was the priest and the landowner who held power. For young Rasputin, the gulf between the simple life of Siberia and the wealth of the capital was unimaginable. He would one day cross that gulf, but in childhood he knew only mud roads, smoke-filled huts, and the frozen silence of long winters. Marriage came early for peasants. In 1887, when Rasputin was 18, he wed a local girl named Praskovia Dubrovina. She was devoted, strong, and steady, the opposite of his restless spirit. Together they settled in Pokrovskoye and had children, though many did not survive infancy. Their union anchored Rasputin for a time. He worked the fields, tended animals, and lived as a typical peasant husband. But his wildness never fully left him. He drank, fought, and often vanished on wanderings. Praskovia endured it with patience, raising the family even as her husband seemed drawn to a different path. Around this time, Rasputin experienced what some called a conversion. He began to seek God with new intensity. He prayed for hours, fasted, and spoke of visions of the Virgin Mary and of Christ. He claimed to feel a divine light within him. He also began to heal animals and people with simple prayers or touches, at least according to those who later recalled his youth. His reputation as a man with gifts spread beyond his village. Pilgrims and wanderers often carried news across Siberia, and word of Rasputin began to move with them. For some he was a fool, for others a holy man in the making. The tension between sin and holiness marked him from the start. He could spend nights in taverns, then days in prayer. He confessed to theft, lust, and pride, yet spoke of God's mercy with conviction. This strange mix confused people but also drew them to him. In a land where saints often came from the least likely souls, some began to believe Rasputin carried a spark of divine grace. His piercing stare, which unsettled many as a child, now seemed to carry weight. People said he could look into their souls. In small villages such tales grew quickly, and soon he was more than just a farmer with a wild streak. He was a figure of mystery. The Russian Orthodox faith had a deep hold on the people. Icons, candles, and relics filled their lives. Pilgrimage to holy sites was a tradition for those seeking healing or forgiveness. Rasputin decided to take part in this world of wandering holy men. He left his home for long journeys, walking for weeks at a time, visiting monasteries, praying in remote chapels. These travels would later define him, but even in his youth they marked him as different. He was no longer just a peasant of Pokrovskoy. He was on a path that would lead far from Siberia. His early life gave him traits that never left him. The raw toughness of Siberia gave him endurance. The grief of lost siblings gave him a sense of fate. The poverty of his village gave him the ability to connect with common people. The church gave him language and symbols he would use to claim authority. From these roots, Rasputin grew into the man who would one day walk the halls of the Winter Palace. Yet in 1869, no one could imagine such a journey. He was a barefoot child in a frozen land, marked by loss, driven by strange visions, and restless for something beyond the fields of his birth. The villagers could not have known that this unruly boy would rise to stand beside an empress. They saw only a youth with sharp eyes, a quick temper, and a hunger for more than farm life. He carried scars from grief and shame from misdeeds, yet he also carried an unshakable sense that God had chosen him. Whether this sense was real or imagined did not matter at first. It drove him, and it would carry him from the edge of Siberia to the center of Russia's storm. The Siberian peasant who would become Rasputin, the mystic healer. And prophet was forged in the mud and ice of Pokrovskoy. Every hardship of that early life gave him a story to tell. Every death he witnessed gave him a sense of destiny. Every moment of sin and repentance gave him power to sway hearts. He was no scholar, no soldier, no nobleman. He was the son of farmers, shaped by hunger, cold, and faith. Out of this soil grew one of the most infamous figures of the age. Rasputin's life began to change when he left the familiar world of his village and set out on the long road of the pilgrim. His restless spirit drove him to seek something beyond the fields and taverns of Pokrovskoy. For years he had been marked as strange, part sinner and part seeker, torn between wildness and prayer. Now in his early 20s, with a wife and children at home, he felt the pull of a higher calling. He wanted to draw closer to God. He wanted to find meaning in visions that stirred him, and in the sense of fate that had followed him since childhood. Pilgrimage was a well-known practice in Russia. Ordinary people would leave their homes to walk to monasteries and holy shrines, often traveling hundreds of miles on foot. They went to seek healing, forgiveness, or guidance. The roads of Russia were full of these wandering figures, poor and ragged yet filled with devotion. Rasputin became one of them. He left his wife Praskovia to care for their children and set out with little more than faith to guide him. He walked for days at a time, often in harsh weather, living on scraps of food and the charity of strangers. He He slept in barns, under trees, or on the cold ground, and all the while he prayed. One of his first great journeys took him to the monastery of Verkhochery, a long distance from Pokrovskoy. It was here that he came into contact with monks whose lives were built on fasting, prayer, and obedience. Rasputin was struck by their discipline, yet he did not wish to stay as a monk. He wanted freedom to wander and to speak, to live both in the world and apart from it. He was not drawn to the silence of cloistered walls, but to the open road and the people he could meet along the way. This gave him a different kind of authority. He became known not as a monk but as a stranik, a pilgrim, a holy wanderer. In Russian tradition, such figures could inspire awe and fear, for they were seen as close to God yet untamed. His reputation began to grow. People he met on the road spoke of his piercing eyes, his words of comfort, and his prayers that seemed to carry power. Some said he could calm pain or illness with a touch or a blessing. Others said he was nothing more than a drunken trickster who played at holiness. The truth was often both, for Rasputin's life was never simple. He could fall into sin one night and rise to pray the next morning as if he were pure. This tension became part of his strength, for ordinary people saw in him their own struggle. They too sinned, they too longed for forgiveness, and in Rasputin they found someone who lived both sides of the human soul. His wanderings were not only physical but also spiritual. He claimed to see visions. He spoke of the Virgin Mary guiding him, of Christ appearing to him, of angels and saints whispering in his prayers. He began to believe that he carried a gift, a link to the divine that set him apart. This belief gave him confidence. He preached to peasants along the road, urging them to repent, to pray, to trust in God's mercy. He did not speak with the educated words of priests. His language was simple and rough, filled with the images of the land, the river, the soil. This made him easy to understand. People listened because he spoke as one of them. Rasputin also came into contact with sects outside the mainstream church. Russia was full of small groups who broke away from orthodoxy, seeking more direct forms of faith. Some of these groups practiced extreme rituals of fasting or self-punishment. Others believed in reaching God through ecstatic prayer, dancing, or even sin followed by repentance. There were whispers that Rasputin was influenced by such sects. Some later accused him of joining groups that believed one must sin to feel the joy of forgiveness. Whether this was true or not, Rasputin did show a pattern of indulgence followed by prayer, of falling into temptation and then rising to seek God again. It was a rhythm that marked his whole life. His wife bore the strain of his absences with patience. Praskovia remained in Pokrovskoy, raising the children, farming, and keeping the household alive. She accepted Rasputin's wanderings as part of who he was. In later years, she would defend him against critics, saying he was still a good husband who always returned to her. Yet in these early days, his long pilgrimages left her alone to endure the hardships of Siberian life. Rasputin, however, felt he was on a path he could not abandon. The more he traveled, the more people spoke of him, and the more convinced he became that God had chosen him. At times he returned home, trying to balance his life as husband and father with his call as a pilgrim. He worked the fields, played with his children, and sat in the smoky hut with his wife. But always the road called to him again. Stories from neighbors spread, painting him as both holy and dangerous. Some said he had healed cattle, some said he had cured the sick, others said he seduced women while preaching. Such rumors blurred truth and lie, yet they added to his aura. In a land of superstition and deep faith, a man who drew whispers of miracles or sins could not be ignored. By the turn of the century, Rasputin's fame had spread far beyond his village. Pilgrims who crossed paths with him carried tales to towns and monasteries. Priests heard of him, and some invited him to speak. Monks debated whether he was touched by grace or led by demons. For Rasputin, the attention only deepened his sense of destiny. He began to believe he was more than just a seeker. He was a guide for others, a chosen vessel of God's will. His gaze, his words, his prayers became tools he used to sway those who met him. He had no education, no books, no formal training, yet his presence had power. His pilgrimages grew longer. He traveled to Kazan, to Kiev, to far-off shrines where thousands gathered. He walked the dusty roads with bare feet, living as the poorest of the poor. Yet even in rags he stood out. His tall frame, his burning eyes, his unkempt beard marked him as someone different. Crowds often parted when he spoke, for his voice carried both passion and command. He told peasants that prayer could save them, that God's mercy was endless, that suffering was the road to grace. Many wept, many followed him for a time, and many believed they had met a holy man. In these years Rasputin began to understand the power of his image. He did not dress as a priest, nor did he shave or polish his words. He embraced the roughness of the pilgrim's life. His ragged look, his stare, his strange mix of sin and holiness became his mark. In Russia, where saints often came from humble or broken lives, this image had deep meaning. He was the peasant mystic, the man who rose from mud to speak with God. This role would carry him far, for it gave him a bond with common people and an air of mystery to those in power. As his fame grew, Rasputin began to attract both supporters and enemies. Some priests saw him as a genuine seeker, a man of prayer with a gift for healing. They welcomed him into their churches, gave him shelter, and listened to his visions. Others denounced him as a fraud, a drunkard, a sinner who used religion for his own gain. Monks at Verkhoturye grew wary of him, troubled by the way he drew crowds and the whispers of scandal. He was not bound by rules, and this made him dangerous in the eyes of strict clergy. Yet the more he was criticized, the more people spoke of him. The tension only fed his legend. Rasputin himself did not shrink from scandal. He seemed to thrive on the mix of worship and outrage. When accused of sin, he spoke of forgiveness. When called a fraud, he prayed more fervently. He walked a line between holiness and disgrace, and in doing so he kept people watching. He understood that faith was not only about purity, but about drama, about the struggle of the soul in plain sight. His life became a living sermon, full of stumbles and rises, falls and redemptions. This gave him authenticity to peasants who lived the same struggle every day. By the early 1900s, Rasputin's wanderings had taken him across much of Russia. He had met bishops, monks, and pilgrims. He had prayed in great cathedrals and small roadside chapels. He had walked in storms and slept on frozen ground. Everywhere he went he left behind stories, half truth and half legend. Some said he healed a boy from fever, others said he cast out demons. Still others claimed he seduced women under the guise of prayer. These tales, mixed and retold, created the figure who would soon step onto the stage of history. The pilgrim years were the forge of Rasputin's soul. They stripped away the peasant farmer and shaped the mystic. They taught him how to speak to crowds, how to use his eyes and words to command attention, how to survive on nothing but faith and will. They gave him a sense of authority that no book could provide. He had walked the roads of Russia. He had suffered hunger and cold. He had prayed in countless shrines. He carried these journeys like medals of the spirit. They became his proof when he stood before skeptics. He could always say that he had lived as a true seeker of God. In time his path would lead him to St. Petersburg, the heart of empire, where his peasant faith would meet the glitter of palaces and the desperation of a royal family. But this rise would not have been possible without the years of wandering, praying, and suffering. The pilgrim was the foundation of the prophet. Without the dust of the road and the cold of Siberian nights, there could be no Rasputin of legend. The mystic who would one day whisper in the ear of an empress was first the barefoot man who walked through mud with a prayer on his lips and hunger in his belly. He was a paradox, a man of sin and grace, a wanderer who claimed visions, a peasant who dreamed of God. These contradictions gave him power. They made him human to those who listened and frightening to those who doubted. He did not hide his flaws. He lived them openly, turning weakness into a kind of strength. This was the Rasputin who emerged from the pilgrim years, a man ready to take his place in history. The mystic was born on the roads of Russia, and from those roads he would soon walk into the fate of an empire. The road that began in the frozen fields of Pokrovskoy and stretched across the holy shrines of Russia now drew Rasputin toward the heart of the empire. His wanderings as a pilgrim had given him confidence and fame. He had prayed in monasteries, spoken to peasants, impressed some priests, and unsettled others. Everywhere he went stories grew. Some said he healed the sick. Others said he fell into sin as often as he prayed. Yet what mattered was that people remembered him. His name spread, and in Russia a man of rumor could go far. For Rasputin, the path now led to St. Petersburg, the capital of the Tsars, a world so distant from Siberian soil that it might as well have been another planet. St. Petersburg was the seat of Nicholas II and the court of the Romanovs. It was a city built to display power, with wide streets, palaces of marble and gold, and churches whose domes glittered against the northern sky. To a peasant from Siberia, it must have seemed like a vision from another world. The city had wealth and splendor, yet beneath it there was unrest. Russia was changing fast. Industry was growing, workers filled the factories, and strikes shook the streets. The poor crowded into slums while the elite lived in luxury. Revolution whispered in alleys even as carriages clattered past the Winter Palace. It was here that Rasputin would find his chance to rise. His arrival was not the result of chance alone. His reputation had begun to reach the ears of churchmen who moved in high circles. Among them was Bishop Theophan, a man of learning and influence who served as confessor to the Tsarina Alexandra. Theophan had heard of Rasputin through pilgrims and priests who spoke of his gifts. Some mocked him, but others spoke with awe of his eyes, his prayers, and his power over the sick. Intrigued, Theophan invited Rasputin to St. Petersburg to see for himself. For Rasputin this was a call from destiny. He set out for the capital, unwashed and ragged, but full of confidence that God had prepared a path for him. When Rasputin first entered the salons of the capital, he caused a stir. Here were noble ladies in gowns of silk and jewels, scholars with books and titles, priests in fine robes. Into their midst stepped a tall peasant in coarse clothes, his beard wild, his eyes burning. He smelled of the road, of sweat and earth. His speech was rough and full of peasant words. Yet the moment he opened his mouth, something happened. He spoke of God's mercy, of prayer, of the need to repent. He spoke with passion, with simple force, without the polish of sermons, but with the fire of conviction. The ladies leaned forward, the priests frowned, and all eyes were on him. Rasputin had found his audience. In the world of St. Petersburg there was a hunger for mysticism. The late 19th century had seen the growth of interest in spiritualism, visions, and the search for holy men. The Russian Orthodox faith was strong, yet many of the upper classes sought something more direct, something that broke through ritual and tradition. They wanted to touch the divine, to feel that God was close. Rasputin offered this in his own raw way. He was no scholar, no monk locked in study. He was a peasant who had walked the roads, who had prayed in forests, who claimed to see visions of Christ and the Virgin. To aristocrats wary of polished words, his rough voice and wild gaze seemed more real, more authentic. Rasputin began to gather followers among the wealthy women of the city. They invited him to their homes, asked him to bless them, sought his prayers for their families. They were drawn to his unpolished manner, to the way he seemed to look into their souls. They confessed sins to him they would not speak to priests. They wept as he told them that God forgave them, that prayer could heal their hearts. Some saw him as a saint. Others whispered that his closeness to these women was scandalous. The rumors began almost at once. Was he holy, or was he a fraud who charmed noble ladies with his eyes, and touched the question hung in the air, and it never left him? Bishop Theophan was impressed by Rasputin, at least at first. He welcomed him into his circle, introduced him to influential priests, and defended him against critics. He believed Rasputin was a man of God sent to stir the faith of the people. With his support, Rasputin's reputation grew, and soon his name reached even higher circles. By 1905, in the midst of political unrest, Rasputin was introduced to the Tsar and Tsarina. This meeting would shape his fate and theirs. Nicholas II and Alexandra lived under the shadow of tragedy. Their son Alexei, heir to the throne, suffered from hemophilia, a disease that caused him to bleed uncontrollably, even from small injuries. The boy's life was fragile, and his illness was a secret guarded fiercely by the family. Alexandra in particular was tormented by his suffering. She prayed constantly for his healing, sought doctors, and turned to faith for hope. When she heard of a holy man from Siberia, who was said to have powers of healing, she agreed to meet him. Rasputin was brought before the royal family, a peasant among emperors, and the course of history shifted. Accounts of the first meeting vary, but all agree that Alexandra was struck by him. Rasputin's gaze, his calm words, his simple faith touched her deeply. He prayed for Alexei, and the boy's pain seemed to ease. Whether by chance, by suggestion, or by some hidden gift, Rasputin appeared to bring relief where doctors had failed. For Alexandra, this was a sign from God. She believed Rasputin was sent to save her son, and therefore to save the dynasty itself. From that moment, she became his greatest defender, his shield against criticism, and his path to influence. Rasputin's place at court was not official. He held no title, no office. He was simply a peasant holy man who came and went as he pleased, yet his bond with the Tsarina gave him power that few could match. Ministers, nobles, and priests soon realized that to reach Alexandra's heart, one had to win the favor of Rasputin. His prayers, his advice, his presence was sought not only by peasants but by princes. He who had once begged for bread on the road now sat in rooms of silk, while candles burned and nobles bowed. It was a transformation beyond imagining, yet Rasputin wore it with the same rough clothes, the same wild beard, the same burning eyes. He remained the pilgrim in the palace. The people of St. Petersburg reacted with both awe and disgust. Some hailed Rasputin as a saint who healed the ear and brought God's grace to the royal family. Others saw him as a filthy peasant who had wormed his way into power through the weakness of a desperate empress. Satirical papers mocked him, depicting him as a lecherous monk surrounded by swooning women. Stories of his late-night visits to noble homes spread. Rumors of sin clung to his name, yet so too did stories of miracles. This mixture of scandal and reverence became the hallmark of his life in the capital. Rasputin himself seemed untouched by the storm. He prayed with the Tsarina, blessed the young Tsarevich, and spoke words of faith that calmed Alexandra's fears. He also drank heavily, visited brothels, and boasted to friends of his closeness to power. He lived in two worlds at once, holy man and sinner, prophet and peasant. The very contradictions that marked him in Siberia now marked him in St. Petersburg. They confused his enemies and entranced his followers. He was both more and less than he seemed, and in that mystery lay his strength. The years after his arrival in the capital saw his influence grow steadily. Each time Alexei fell into crisis, Rasputin was called. Each time he appeared, the boy seemed to recover. Alexandra's trust deepened, and Nicholas, though more cautious, also came to see Rasputin as vital to his family's hope. In the eyes of the royal couple, he was not just a healer. He was a messenger of God sent to preserve their dynasty. In a time when Russia shook with strikes, protests, and revolution, they clung to him as a lifeline. To attack Rasputin was to attack the throne itself. Thus, Rasputin, the Siberian peasant, became Rasputin, the court mystic. He walked the halls of the Winter Palace, his boots muddy, his beard untrimmed, his eyes fixed on those who trembled before him. The salons of noble ladies filled with whispers of his power, the newspapers filled with cartoons of his scandals. Priests debated his soul, ministers feared his influence, and all the while he moved between hut and palace, tavern and chapel, sin and prayer, carrying with him the strange force that had marked him since childhood. The road had brought him from the frozen banks of the Tura to the throne of the Tsar, and from here it would lead him into the storm that would consume an empire. Rasputin's rise within the walls of the Winter Palace was not sudden, but it grew with each year until he became the one person the Tsarina trusted above all others. Alexandra was a woman of deep faith and deep anxiety. She carried the burden of an empire upon her shoulders and the burden of guilt for passing on the illness that plagued her son. The boy Alexei was the center of her heart, and his fragile body ruled her life. No matter the splendor of palaces or the bowing of servants, she lived with the terror that one small fall could bring his death. Doctors could do little. Science failed her. Prayers filled her days. And in Rasputin she found what she longed for most, hope. From the moment she saw her son calm under Rasputin's prayer, she believed he was sent by God. Each time the boy fell ill, she called for him. And each time Rasputin came, the crisis seemed to pass. Whether by chance, by suggestion, or by some strange gift, the boy's bleeding often slowed when Rasputin was near. Alexandra saw this not as luck, but as proof of divine favor. She was convinced that without Rasputin her son would die, and without her son the throne would fall. This belief bound her to him in chains of devotion that no scandal could break. Rasputin understood her need. He soothed her with words of mercy, told her to trust in God, told her that her son would live to rule. He prayed beside her, wept with her, and looked into her eyes with a calm that gave her strength. In a court filled with flatterers and schemers, he seemed pure. He spoke not of politics, but of faith. He gave her what she could not find in ministers or nobles, the sense that God still watched over her family. For this she loved him like no other. She called him our friend, her true guide, her chosen one. In her letters she spoke of him with warmth and reverence, as if he were a saint. This devotion alarmed others at court. Ministers and nobles watched as a ragged peasant gained the ear of the empress. They saw him enter the palace at night, stay for hours in her rooms, and walk away with her blessing. They heard her defend him against every attack, dismissing charges of sin as lies from jealous men. They saw her anger when anyone questioned him. For Alexandra, criticism of Rasputin was betrayal of her family, and she would not forgive it. This made him untouchable. With her protection, he moved through the highest circles of power with confidence, knowing that the throne itself shielded him. Rasputin's relationship with Nicholas was different. The Tsar was cautious, reserved, and less open to emotional bonds. He trusted his wife and knew she believed Rasputin was vital, so he accepted him, though with more distance. He met with him, listened to him, and sometimes took his advice, especially when it touched on the health of Alexei. But he did not share Alexandra's devotion. To Nicholas, Rasputin was useful and perhaps blessed, but not beyond doubt. Even so, as the years passed, the Tsar too came to see that Rasputin's presence seemed tied to the survival of the heir. That was enough to ensure his place. The Russian people began to hear of this strange figure who whispered to the royal family. Newspapers carried rumors of a peasant holy man who held the fate of the empire in his hands. Satirical sketches showed him as a sorcerer, a drunk, or a lecher. Pamphlets accused him of corrupting noble women, of taking bribes, of using hypnosis to control the empress. Some stories were true, others wild invention, but together they created an image that grew darker with each year. To the public he was both feared and mocked. To the court he was both threat and protector. To Alexandra he was the hand of God. Rasputin himself seemed to thrive on the mix of reverence and scandal. He continued to live as he always had, wandering between prayer and sin. He would spend hours in deep devotion, fasting and chanting, then slip into nights of drinking and women. He spoke openly of weakness and of forgiveness, telling followers that one must fall to rise, that only through sin could one know true mercy. This message shocked priests and delighted his followers. It allowed him to justify behavior that others called shameful. To Alexandra, such rumors were lies spread by those who wished to destroy him. She refused to listen. Her faith in him was unshaken. The bond between them grew stronger during times of crisis. In 1907, Alexei suffered a severe attack that left him close to death. Doctors could do little, and Alexandra was nearly broken with fear. Rasputin prayed at the boy's side, spoke words of calm, and told the empress that her son would live. The boy's bleeding slowed and his condition improved. Alexandra saw this as a miracle. She believed Rasputin had saved her son's life. This event sealed his place forever. No matter what followed, she would never abandon him. To her, he was the guardian of her child and of the throne itself. As Rasputin's influence grew, so did his enemies. Many in the aristocracy despised him. They saw him as a filthy peasant who corrupted the empress and shamed the throne. They feared his sway over decisions, though in truth his role was often more spiritual than political in these early years. Still, the sight of noble women flocking to him, kneeling before him, confessing sins to him, enraged their husbands and brothers. Priests too began to denounce him, accusing him of false visions and immoral acts. The Holy Synod, the governing body of the church, debated his case and sought ways to curb his influence. Yet each attack failed, for Alexandra shielded him with fierce devotion. Rasputin grew used to the life of the capital. He no longer wandered the roads as before. He lived in apartments, received visitors, and held gatherings where women and men came to seek his blessing. His home was often crowded, filled with smoke, singing, prayer, and laughter. He gave advice freely, spoke of visions, and laid his hands on those who asked for healing. For some he was a source of hope, for others a scandal. He moved through this world with ease, never doubting his place, never questioning his path. He believed he was chosen, and each day seemed to confirm it. The Empress wrote letters to him filled with trust and affection. She called him her only friend, her guide, her strength in dark hours. She begged him to visit when her heart was heavy, to pray when her son was ill, to stand beside her when all others failed. These letters, when discovered later, fed rumors of intimacy. Enemies whispered that their bond was not only spiritual but physical. Such charges wounded her deeply, yet she ignored them. To her, Rasputin was beyond such shame. He was the one soul who saw her pain and gave her peace. The power of their bond was not in titles or offices, but in faith. Alexandra believed he was God's gift. That belief gave him more strength than any throne or church could bestow. It made him untouchable even when scandals mounted. It made him feared even when he held no position. Ministers who wished to please the Empress sought his favor. Priests who wished to reach the court bowed to him. Enemies who wished to destroy him found their path blocked by her unshakable loyalty. In this way, Rasputin, the peasant of Siberia, became the hidden power at the heart of the empire. The years passed, and his role only deepened. Each crisis in Alexei's health brought him back to the palace. Each time his prayers seemed to ease the boy's pain, the Empress's devotion grew. The people outside the palace grew restless, angered by war, poverty, and strikes. Yet inside the palace, one man's words carried more weight than generals or ministers. Rasputin whispered of faith, of hope, of the will of God, and the Empress listened. She wrote of him as her only support in a world of enemies. She clung to him as Russia trembled. Her bond to him was unbreakable. Rasputin's own faith in his destiny burned bright. He spoke to friends of visions where God showed him the future of Russia. He told them he was chosen to protect the throne, that as long as he lived the dynasty would stand. He warned of disaster if he were killed, a prophecy that would one day seem hauntingly true. He carried himself with the certainty of a man who believed the fate of a nation rested on his shoulders. This belief gave him courage and arrogance, for he saw himself as beyond the reach of ordinary men. He was God's servant, God's chosen, and no scandal or attack could touch him. In this chapter of his life, Rasputin became more than a man. To the Empress he was a savior. To his followers he was a saint. To his enemies he was a monster. He stood at the center of myth even while alive. Each story told about him, whether of healing or of sin, added to his legend. He was no longer the barefoot pilgrim wandering the roads of Siberia. He was the confidant of the Empress, the protector of the air, the most mysterious figure in the empire. His eyes looked out from behind the palace walls, and all Russia whispered his name. As Rasputin's presence at court grew stronger, so too did the cloud of scandal that followed him. From the moment he first set foot in St. Petersburg, he had been the subject of gossip. But as his bond with Alexandra deepened, those whispers swelled into a storm. To the common people, he was the peasant who had bewitched the Empress. To the church, he was a dangerous figure who mocked their authority. And to the aristocracy, he was a threat to their dignity. They called him the mad monk, though he was never a monk, and painted him as a sorcerer who held the throne in thrall. Whether he walked the streets or prayed in the palace, rumors of sin clung to him. Part of the scandal came from Rasputin's own way of life. He did not change to fit the polished manners of the court. He drank in taverns, sang loudly, and staggered through the streets at night with followers. He visited houses of ill repute and was seen in the company of women from every rank of society. He could be found praying with noble ladies in 1 hour and drinking with peasants in the next. He lived without shame, claiming that sin was a path to grace. To him, one must fall to feel the mercy of God, and in this belief he excused behavior that others saw as disgraceful. Such acts made him a target, yet they also gave him power over those who felt trapped by guilt. To confess to him was to find release, for he forgave without judgment and spoke of God's endless mercy. Women in particular were drawn to him. They came to his home, sought his prayers, and wept at his feet. Some claimed he healed them, Some said he gave them peace. Others fell into his arms as lovers. The lines between faith and desire blurred. His gaze, his words, his rough hands were said to have a strange pull. To his critics, this was proof of corruption. To his defenders, it was proof of his gifts. The church saw danger in this power over women of rank, for it threatened both morality and order. Priests denounced him, newspapers mocked him, but still the women came. Rasputin thrived in the tension, for scandal fed his legend as much as miracles. The Holy Synod, the Council of the Orthodox Church, launched investigations into him more than once. They accused him of false teaching, of immoral acts, of pretending to be holy while leading souls astray. They sought to strip him of influence, but each time they faced the same barrier. Alexandra defended him with fierce passion. She dismissed every charge as lies, the work of those who hated her family. She wrote letters to ministers and priests, demanding that he be left alone. Her protection made him untouchable. No bishop dared move too far against him, for to attack Rasputin was to risk the wrath of the throne. Thus the scandals continued unchecked. The newspapers took full advantage. They printed stories of his wild nights, his drunken songs, his affairs with noble ladies. They showed cartoons of him pulling the strings of the Tsar and Serena like a puppet master. They painted him as the real ruler of Russia, a filthy peasant who had climbed into the bedchamber of the Empress. The people laughed and gasped, half believing, half mocking. The name Rasputin became a byword for corruption, for the fall of morals at the heart of the empire. Yet behind the jokes there was fear, for if such a man truly guided the throne, what hope was left for Russia? Rasputin himself laughed at the rumors. He told friends that people feared what they could not understand. He said his enemies spread lies because they were jealous of his closeness to God. He often mocked those who called him a fraud, saying that only fools looked for saints without sin. He claimed that holiness lay not in purity but in forgiveness, not in denial but in grace. To his mind the scandal proved his power. If he were nothing, why would so many waste time to attack him? He saw himself as chosen, and every rumor was only proof that the devil raged against him. Yet the scandals did real harm. Ministers grew wary of him, aristocrats despised him, the church longed to be rid of him. Only Alexandra's protection kept him safe, and this tied her fate ever more tightly to his. The more the world attacked him, the more she clung to him. She saw the hatred against Rasputin as hatred against her family, and this drove her deeper into his arms. To the outside world, it seemed as if he had bewitched her, as if she could see no fault in him. The truth was simpler yet just as dangerous. She believed he had saved her son, and for that she would forgive him anything. The royal court became divided. Some courtiers believed in Rasputin and sought his blessing. They visited him in secret, asked for prayers, and hoped to share in his power. Others plotted against him, whispering of ways to drive him out. They sent reports of his sins to Nicholas, begged the Tsar to see reason, warned him that the empire's reputation was being destroyed. Nicholas wavered at times, troubled by the endless gossip, but each time his wife's pleas silenced his doubts. He could not bear to break her heart, and so Rasputin remained. His presence became a wound that never healed, bleeding trust from the court with each passing year. The scandals took many forms. Some were stories of drunken orgies, others of money taken for favors, still others of dark rites where he claimed to summon visions. Many of these tales were inventions, spread by enemies to blacken his name, but enough were true to keep the fire alive. Rasputin did drink, he did sleep with women, he did boast of his closeness to the throne. The mixture of truth and lie made it impossible to defend him fully, yet impossible to dismiss him outright. The myth of Rasputin grew until it seemed larger than the man himself. Among the people, he became a figure of fascination and fear. Peasants admired him as one of their own who had risen to the highest place. They saw in him proof that God could lift even the lowest soul. Workers and soldiers spoke of him in taverns, some calling him a prophet, others cursing him as the reason for their misery. The more the newspapers printed, the more his legend spread. Children heard his name as a joke, yet shivered at the thought of his powers. Rasputin was no longer just a man. He was a symbol of everything that seemed broken in Russia. and at the same time a symbol of the strange magic that still clung to the throne. As years passed, his behavior became more reckless. He believed himself protected by destiny, by Alexandra, by God. He no longer feared the anger of ministers or the judgment of priests. He spoke openly against those who opposed him, cursed bishops, mocked nobles, and boasted that he could command the empress with a word. His arrogance shocked even his friends. Yet he was not without charm. In moments of kindness he could be gentle, listening to peasants with patience, blessing children, giving coins to beggars. These acts of mercy softened his image for those close to him, though to the wider world he remained the scandalous monk. The church grew desperate. Bishops begged Nicholas to send him away, to banish him to Siberia, to save the throne from shame. They warned that faith itself was being mocked by his presence. Nicholas hesitated but did nothing. He was torn between the warnings of his advisors and the tears of his wife. In the end, her voice always won. To her, sending Rasputin away would be to condemn her son to death. Thus the scandal deepened, the empire groaned, and the man from Pokrovskoy sat at the heart of it all, praying, drinking, sinning, and smiling. By now Rasputin was more than scandal, he was prophecy. He told friends that as long as he lived the dynasty would stand, but if he were killed the throne would fall and the Romanovs with it. These words spread like fire. To his followers they were proof of his vision. To his enemies they were a warning that his death would bring chaos. The prophecy gave him a kind of shield. Even those who hated him feared that striking him down might fulfill his words. Thus he lived on, a scandal and a mystery, a sinner and a saint, the peasant who shook the throne with nothing but faith, sin, and the loyalty of a desperate empress. The scandals that surrounded him did not weaken his place. They only made him more famous, more feared, more talked about. He was the story of the age, the shadow in the palace, the symbol of decay, the sign of hope, depending on who spoke his name. He lived as if nothing could touch him, as if his destiny was fixed. Yet with each passing year the anger against him grew, until men began to whisper not only of banishment but of murder. For the moment he stood untouchable, wrapped in the faith of the Serena and the myths that swirled about him. But the storm was gathering. The scandalous monk who walked the halls of power would one day face the price of his fame. The outbreak of the Great War in 1914 changed Russia, and it changed Rasputin. Until then his influence had been centered on the palace, on the health of the young heir, and on the heart of the empress. Now the empire faced its greatest trial, and in the shadow of war his role grew even more troubling and more powerful. Russia entered the war with pride, banners flying, soldiers marching through the streets of St. Petersburg, crowds cheering the Tsar. Yet behind the cheers lay fear, for the nation was vast but weak, its industries poor, its army large but ill-supplied. In the first months men died by the thousands, trains carried endless wounded back from the front, and families began to mourn. Hope gave way to anger. In this storm Rasputin's name was never far from the lips of the people. At first he was not at the center of the war effort. He still spent his days between prayer and drinking, between visits to the palace and nights in taverns. But even in those early days he spoke of the conflict in ways that shocked the court. He warned that the war would bring ruin to Russia. He told the Tsar that victory was impossible, that the empire would fall if it sent more men to die. To many, such words sounded like treason. At a time when priests, blessed soldiers and papers spoke of glory, Rasputin alone spoke of doom. He said blood would drown the land and the throne would topple. He said God had shown him that peace was the only path. These warnings earned him hatred from generals and nobles, but they bound him tighter to Alexandra, who believed his visions more than the words of her ministers. In the first year of war, Rasputin was attacked in St. Petersburg by a woman named Kyonia Gusieva, a follower of a monk who hated him. She stabbed him in the stomach, and for a time it seemed he would die. The wound was deep. He lost much blood, and doctors gave little hope. Yet against all odds he survived. His recovery was slow and painful, but when he rose again he claimed it as proof that his destiny could not be broken. His survival added to his legend. People said he could not be killed, that God himself shielded him. Enemies cursed that even a knife could not rid them of him. Alexandra saw his recovery as a miracle and clung to him with more devotion than ever. As the war dragged on, Rasputin's role at court grew larger. Nicholas faced pressure from all sides. Generals urged more attacks. Ministers demanded greater control, and the people cried out for bread. In 1915, Nicholas made a fateful choice. Against the advice of many, he took command of the army himself, leaving the palace to live at the front. He was no soldier, but he believed it was his duty as Tsar to lead in person. This decision left Alexandra in charge of the government in his absence. She turned again and again to Rasputin. His voice guided her choices, his prayers calmed her fears, and his visions shaped her decisions. To many it seemed as if the empire was ruled not by the Tsar or Serena, but by a Siberian peasant. Ministers and nobles grew frantic. They saw Rasputin's hand in every appointment, every dismissal, every strange policy that came from the palace. He advised Alexandra on who should hold office, which generals should be trusted, which men were loyal and which were not. Sometimes his choices seemed random, driven by personal likes or dislikes. At other times he seemed to act out of spite, punishing those who had crossed him. The government fell into chaos. Ministers changed constantly and corruption spread. Enemies of the throne pointed to Rasputin as the cause of it all. They said he was a traitor, a German spy, a drunk who whispered ruin into the ear of the Empress. The more defeats Russia suffered, the more the people cursed his name. The war made life unbearable for ordinary Russians. Soldiers died in trenches without boots or bullets. Families starved in cities where bread grew scarce. Strikes and protests broke out, women marched for food, and soldiers joined them in anger. The image of Rasputin grew darker with each day. Pamphlets showed him feasting while others starved, lying in the arms of the Empress while soldiers bled at the front. Caricatures painted him as the true ruler of Russia, the puppet master behind Alexandra, the enemy of the people. Some believed he was working for Germany, sending secrets to the Kaiser, plotting to destroy Russia from within. There was no proof, but proof was no longer needed. He had become the face of all that was wrong. Rasputin did not hide from the storm. He continued to drink, to take women to his home, to boast of his power. He walked the streets as if untouchable, waving away the curses that followed him. He told friends that God had shown him his death would come only when the throne itself was doomed. He laughed at his enemies, calling them fools who could not see the truth. He warned again and again that the war would destroy the dynasty, that peace was the only hope. But his words were lost in the roar of cannons and the pride of generals. His prophecies, dismissed as madness, would soon prove all too true. Alexandra's dependence on him reached its peak during these years. She wrote letter after letter to Nicholas at the front, repeating Rasputin's advice, urging the Tsar to listen to him, calling him their only friend. She believed that without him they would be lost. Her devotion made her blind to his flaws, deaf to every warning, and more isolated from the court. Ministers despaired, nobles muttered, soldiers cursed, but still she clung to Rasputin. Her faith in him was stronger than her faith in any other soul. To her he was not a scandal but a saint, the guardian of her son, the savior of her family. She saw enemies everywhere, but in him she saw only light. The more the empire weakened, the more urgent became the whispers to remove him. Generals spoke of his treachery, priests called him the devil. Aristocrats plotted in secret. They saw him as the rot at the heart of the throne, the reason the people had lost faith, the source of the shame that blackened Russia's name. Yet each plot stumbled on the same barrier: Alexandra's devotion and Nicholas's fear of breaking her heart. As long as she defended him, he could not be touched. But the fury against him only grew, and by 1916 men began to whisper not of exile but of death. They said only his blood could save the throne. Meanwhile, Rasputin himself seemed careless of danger. He drank more, sinned more, and boasted more. He told women that his touch brought them closer to God. He told followers that the Empress would do nothing without his blessing. He told enemies to beware, for his death would bring their ruin. He moved between palace and tavern, sinner and saint, never doubting that he was chosen. In his eyes the war was madness, the throne was doomed, and only his prayers kept Russia from falling at once. He saw himself as the last barrier between the dynasty and collapse. and this belief gave him the strength to carry on even as hatred burned around him. By late 1916, the empire was near breaking. Soldiers deserted in droves, workers starved, cities seethed with anger. Ministers begged the Tsar to return from the front, to restore order, to cut Rasputin away. Nicholas refused. He trusted his wife, and she trusted Rasputin, and so the empire drifted ever closer to disaster. In the streets, people whispered that the Empress was a German spy and Rasputin her lover. They said the throne was lost, that the people must rise. The myth of Rasputin had grown greater than the man. He was no longer just a peasant holy man. He was the symbol of corruption, the sign of weakness, the shadow of ruin over the house of Romanov. The war had turned him into the most hated man in Russia, yet he still believed himself unbreakable. He told friends that if he were killed, the throne would fall within months, that his blood would mark the end of the dynasty. These words would soon echo as prophecy. For now he lived as always, drinking, praying, sinning, and smiling, while the world around him crumbled. He did not know how near his end was, or how soon his prophecy would come to pass. But he knew the storm was coming, and in that storm the scandalous monk of Siberia would meet his fate. By the last months of 1916, Rasputin was at the center of every whisper in Russia. To his followers, he was still the man who could pray away pain and bring hope to the sick. To the Tsarina, he was the one soul she trusted. But to his enemies, he was the shadow that had poisoned the throne. The war had drained the land of men and food. Families starved in the cities, soldiers deserted in the fields, and the people blamed the court. When they looked to the palace, they saw not Nicholas, but Rasputin, the peasant who sat in the heart of power. To them he was the reason for defeat, the reason for hunger, the reason why the empire seemed broken beyond repair. Hatred of him spread through drawing rooms, barracks, and streets until it became more than talk. Men began to plot his death. The leaders of the conspiracy were not peasants or workers, but nobles who feared for the empire and their own position. Prince Felix Yusupov, the richest man in Russia and husband of the Tsar's niece, became the heart of the plan. He was young, handsome, and spoiled, yet he saw himself as a patriot who must save the throne from ruin. Rasputin, in his eyes, was a disease that must be cut away. He gathered others who shared his fear and rage. Among them was Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, cousin of the Tsar, who believed the dynasty itself would fall unless Rasputin was destroyed. They were joined by right-wing politician Vladimir Purishkevich, a man who thundered in the Duma against the peasant who held sway over the Empress. Together they formed a bond of blood, a pact to kill Rasputin for the good of Russia. The conspirators spoke in secret, meeting in grand houses where servants kept silent. They told themselves they were saving the throne, saving Alexandra from her folly, saving Nicholas from disgrace. They told themselves the people would cheer once Rasputin was gone. Yet beneath these noble words lay fear. They feared that if Rasputin lived much longer, there would be nothing left to save. They feared that the empire would fall, and that they would fall with it. They convinced themselves that one death could change the course of war and history. It was a desperate dream, yet desperation ruled them. They began to prepare. Rasputin himself knew enemies circled him. He laughed at them, telling friends that they could stab him, poison him, drown him, but his death would mean the fall of the Romanovs. He said God had shown him this in visions. He told Alexandra that if he died at the hands of nobles, the throne would not survive the year. She shuddered at his words and begged him to be careful, but he was careless by nature. He drank openly, boasted of his closeness to the Empress, and mocked those who threatened him. He believed his destiny was shield enough, that no man could end his life before its time. In this belief he walked blindly toward his fate. The plotters chose December for their strike. Winter gripped St. Petersburg, snow lay heavy on the streets, and hunger bit deep in the homes of the poor. The war bled the nation dry, and anger at the court was near boiling point. To the conspirators the time seemed right. They planned to lure Rasputin to the Yusupov palace on the pretext of meeting Felix's wife, a woman of great beauty whom Rasputin long wished to meet. Once there, they would kill him in secret, hide his body, and tell the world that he had vanished. They believed the people would rejoice, the throne would be saved, and the empire would find strength again. It was a dream born of fear, but it drove them to act. In the nights before the deed, Felix Yusupov was restless. He wrote later of how he felt trapped by fate, how he believed God himself demanded Rasputin's death. He visited the man and spoke with him, acting as friend, hiding his hatred behind smiles. Rasputin welcomed him, never suspecting the dagger in his heart. Felix later said he felt the strange pull of Rasputin's eyes, the power that had entranced so many, yet he steeled himself with thoughts of Russia. He told himself he must kill not for hate but for duty. Around him the other plotters sharpened their plans, loading pistols, preparing poison, arranging a room where the deed would be done. Even as enemies plotted, Rasputin continued his life without change. He prayed with Alexandra, assured her that Alexei would live, told her that God's hand was on the throne. He drank with friends, sang loud songs, wandered the streets with his coat open to the snow. He ignored warnings from those who begged him to be careful. He said death would come only when the empire itself was doomed. He trusted his visions more than reason. In this trust he walked into the trap laid for him. On the day of the plan, Rasputin was summoned by Felix to the palace. He was told that Felix's wife wished to meet him in secret, and he agreed with eagerness. That night he walked through the frozen city, snow crunching under his boots, cloak wrapped against the cold. He entered the grand house, walls lined with art and gold, a palace of splendor far from the huts of Siberia, where he was born. He descended into the basement, where the plotters had prepared wine and cakes laced with poison. They greeted him warmly, pretending to be friends, offering drink and sweet food. He sat at the table, unaware that each bite carried death. He ate, he drank, and still he lived. The poison seemed to have no effect. The plotters grew anxious. Felix grew pale. Rasputin laughed and sang, and the night dragged on. This moment would become legend, told and retold in many forms. Some said the poison was weak, others that Rasputin was truly protected by God. In the end, when poison failed, Felix took a pistol and shot him. Rasputin fell, blood staining the carpet, and they believed him dead. They left the room relieved, speaking of how at last Russia was saved. But when Felix returned to look at the body, Rasputin stirred. He rose to his feet, eyes blazing, blood pouring from his side. He lunged at Felix, hands reaching, voice roaring. He staggered out into the snow, fleeing the palace, while the conspirators chased him in terror. They fired again and again until at last he collapsed in the courtyard. Even then they feared he might rise once more. They bound him, beat him, and dragged his body to the frozen river. There they cast him beneath the ice, hoping the waters would hide the deed. When the body was found days later, the city was filled with rumors. Some said he was poisoned, shot, stabbed, and drowned, yet still lived until the end. Some said water filled his lungs, proof that he had been alive when cast into the river. Others swore he had cursed his killers with his final breath. Truth and myth merged until it was impossible to know where one ended and the other began. What was clear was that Rasputin was dead, and with him died the last fragile shield of the Romanovs. His prophecy, spoken again and again, echoed through the palace. If he died at the hands of nobles, the throne would fall. Within 3 months, revolution would sweep away the dynasty forever. The conspirators believed at first that they had saved Russia. They expected cheers, gratitude, a surge of hope. Instead, the empire stumbled on, broken and starving, while the war raged. Alexandra wept and raged, calling his killers traitors. Nicholas mourned in silence, torn between grief and duty. The people whispered that the murder was proof of chaos at the heart of power. Instead of strength, it showed weakness. Instead of unity, it showed division. The killing of Rasputin did not save the throne. It only revealed how far it had rotted. The plotters had removed the man, but not the despair that fed his legend. Rasputin's enemies had feared him alive, but dead he became larger still. His story spread in 1,000 tales. Some saw him as devil, some as saint, all saw him as symbol. He had risen from mud huts to the palace, from nameless peasant to the most feared man in Russia. He had lived as sinner and prophet, healer and drunk, holy man and scandal. He had died in violence, his prophecy echoing in the halls of power. His enemies thought they had ended him, but in truth they had given him immortality. His shadow hung over the throne until the day it fell. and his name lived on long after his killers were forgotten. Thus the plots that sought to end him brought not salvation but doom. Rasputin's blood marked the last winter of the empire, and the ice that held his body cracked as the empire itself cracked. His enemies had killed the man, but they had not killed the storm he had foretold. That storm was already breaking, and soon it would sweep away all who had stood against him, and all who had stood with him. The night of Rasputin's death has become one of the most famous tales in Russian history. It has been told so many times that truth and myth lie tangled together, yet the power of the story remains. It was December 1916. The cold of winter pressed heavy on the streets of Petrograd, and the empire stood on the edge of collapse. Hunger and anger grew each day. Soldiers deserted at the front, workers struck in the cities, and all eyes turned to the palace. In whispers the people said the empress was ruled by Rasputin, that he had bewitched her, that his word carried more weight than generals and ministers. The hatred that clung to his name was now so fierce that men who once bowed before him decided that he must die. The main plot was led by Prince Felix Yusupov, the young noble who was married to a niece of the Tsar. He was rich beyond measure, his palace filled with treasures, his life one of ease, yet he grew restless and felt shame at the state of the empire. He believed Rasputin was the cause of Russia's ruin, and that only by killing him could the throne be saved. At his side was Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, cousin of Nicholas, who shared his fear for the dynasty. They were joined by Vladimir Purishkevich, a fiery politician who thundered in speeches against Rasputin. These men and a few others swore an oath to act. They called themselves patriots, yet what they planned was murder. The choice of place fell on Yusupov's own palace by the river Moika. Beneath its fine halls lay cellars where they could carry out their scheme unseen. They told Rasputin that Felix's wife, the famed beauty Irina, wished to meet him in secret. Rasputin, who had long been drawn to her, agreed to come. It was a simple lure, but he suspected nothing. He believed himself untouchable, protected by the hand of God, and so he walked into the snare without fear. That night snow lay thick on the streets, the sky was heavy, and the city slept in bitter silence. Rasputin left his home in his fur coat and walked through the cold to the palace. He was greeted warmly by Felix and led into the cellar, where a table was laid with cakes and wine. He asked where Irina was, and Felix told him she would come later. For now he should eat and drink. Rasputin sat, smiling, at ease, and began to talk as he always did. The food and drink were poisoned with cyanide. Felix and the others waited for the poison to work, watching him closely. He ate, he drank, he laughed, and still he lived. Minutes passed, then hours, and the poison seemed to have no effect. Felix grew pale with fear. He had been told the dose was strong enough to kill many men, yet Rasputin sat before him alive. He sang songs, told stories, and mocked the nervous looks of his hosts. It seemed as if nothing could harm him. At last Felix, in despair, left the room and returned with a revolver. He raised the gun and fired. The shot struck Rasputin in the chest. He fell to the floor, blood pouring, and lay still. Believing him dead, Felix hurried upstairs to tell the others the deed was done. They rejoiced, thinking their task complete. But when Felix returned to look upon the body, a strange sight met him. Rasputin stirred. He opened his eyes, rose slowly to his feet, and staggered toward the door. Blood covered his shirt, yet his gaze burned with fury. He lurched forward, muttering words, reaching out with his hands. Felix cried out in terror as Rasputin pushed past him and stumbled into the snowy courtyard. The others rushed down in shock. They saw Rasputin moving through the snow, bent and bleeding, but still alive. Panic seized them. Purishkevich drew his pistol and fired again and again. Bullets struck him, and he fell at last onto the ground. Even then they feared he might rise again. They beat him, bound his arms, and dragged him to the river. They broke a hole in the ice and flung his body into the black water. The current carried him beneath the frozen surface, and the night closed over him. The conspirators fled back to the palace, shaken yet triumphant, certain that their deed would change Russia. When his body was found days later, the rumors grew wild. Some said his lungs held water, proof that he had still been alive when thrown into the river. Others said he had been shot in the head at close range. Others still swore that he cursed his killers with his last breath. The autopsy could not still the storm of tales. People said poison had not touched him, bullets had not stopped him, drowning had not silenced him. They said he had lived through every attempt until sheer brute force at last dragged him down. Whether truth or myth, the tale of his death only added to his legend. He became the man who would not die, the devil monk, the holy fool, the prophet, all in one. Alexandra's grief was terrible. She wept as if her own soul had been torn from her. She raged against the murderers, calling them traitors who had doomed her family. She believed Rasputin's words that his death would bring the fall of the dynasty. She prayed by his grave, begged God for mercy, and clung to her son, knowing that the protector she trusted above all was gone. Nicholas too was shaken. He had lost the man his wife believed was sent by God to guard their heir. But unlike her, he did not rage. He grew quiet, retreating further into despair as the empire slid closer to ruin. The conspirators at first believed they had saved Russia. They told themselves the people would rejoice, that the throne would rise again free of Rasputin's shadow. But instead, confusion and anger spread. Some hailed them as heroes, others cursed them as murderers. Alexandra would not forgive them, and Nicholas exiled Dmitri and Felix in disgrace. The war raged on, the people starved, and the empire continued to crumble. Killing Rasputin did nothing to heal the sickness at the heart of Russia. If anything, it only deepened the sense of chaos. The myth of that night spread faster than truth. In taverns, men swore Rasputin had walked out of the palace with bullets in his chest, roaring like a beast. Women whispered that he had cursed the throne to fall within months. Children told stories that he rose from the river ice to stalk the city at night. The man who had been hated in life became larger still in death. His prophecy seemed to hang over the land like smoke. Within 3 months, the February Revolution would drive Nicholas from the throne and bring the Romanovs to captivity. In the eyes of many, it seemed that Rasputin's words had come true. Even his killers found little joy in their act. Felix lived in exile, haunted by the memory of that night, writing books to justify what he had done. Dmitri too was cast out, living abroad until his death, never again close to power. Purishkevich, who had fired the final shots, boasted of his role, yet lived to see Russia torn apart by war and revolution. None of them saved the empire. None of them stopped the fall. They had killed a man, but they could not kill the storm that followed. Rasputin's death marked the end of an age. He had risen from the mud of Siberia to stand beside the throne, and he had died in the palace of princes, beaten and shot and drowned. His life was a riddle of sin and faith, his death a riddle of violence and myth. To some he was a saint who died for his visions, to others a devil who finally met justice. But to all he was a figure of mystery whose shadow hung over the last days of the Romanovs. The story of his murder became legend, not only in Russia but across the world. Papers in Europe and America printed lurid tales of poison and bullets and ice. Writers and artists turned him into a symbol of the madness of the empire. His eyes, fierce and unyielding, stared from posters and pamphlets as if he still lived. His name entered song and story, whispered in fear and wonder. He had lived as a scandal, and he died as a myth, larger in death than ever in life. Thus ended the life of Rasputin on that cold night by the Moika River. His killers believed they had saved the throne, yet within months the throne was gone. His prophecy seemed fulfilled, his shadow seemed to reach from the grave. He had been peasant and pilgrim, healer and sinner, confidant and scandal. He had walked from huts to palaces, from prayer to drunken song, from faith to legend. In his death he became immortal, a story that Russia would never forget. The river ice closed over his body, but his name rose like smoke, drifting through time, never to fade.